The first thing to consider when you want to create a site model is how you're going to input the 3D information, and you do require 3D information to be able to create a site model. Now this 3D information can be in the form of 3D locus points, and if you click or place the 3D locus point, you can set its Z value in the object info palette. You can also input data using the stake object, and here's the stake object, and its mode needs to be set to include as site model data, and then you can see here is the Z value. And the other way that you can input 3D information is via a 3D polygon, and the 3D polygon essentially will have a series of vertex points. And if I double click this, you'll be able to see the vertex points. There's this one, this one, this one, and this one. So 4 vertices as is described here. So essentially these 3 groups of objects, this 3D polygon, these stake objects, and these 3D loci describe exactly the same bit of information. They have the same essentially they will have an X and Y coordinate and a Z coordinate. Now you can use a combination of these 3 types of items, but you need to start off with your 3D information in one of these formats. Sometimes you can get a DWG file that will have 3D contours in it, so multiples of something like this. You might also get a 3D DWG file that has locus points in it. The only thing to be careful of with this input information that you need up front is that if you have a 3D polygon, sometimes these can have many hundreds or even thousands of vertices along the length of the contour. And if this is the case, you're going to get a very slow site model, because each one of those points along the contour is going to be used to recalculate the site model. And there's a special tool in the tool set for site models called Simplify 3D Polygons, and you can look into this tool or look it up in the help to see how to use it. But basically it will simplify a polygon and strip out a lot of the intermediate points. Creating intermediate points is not really increasing the accuracy of your site model. The accuracy of the site model is determined by the spot levels that were taken by the surveyor, or however the terrain was mapped, and guessing where intermediate points might be, or connecting spot levels with contour lines that have multiple vertices along them doesn't increase the accuracy of the terrain model. Now there are some commands in Vectorworks that can help you get information from surveyors into Vectorworks. Obviously importing a DWG file is one method, and sometimes when you do that you'll get a 2-dimensional contour plan that uses polygons, 2D polygons. So in the site modeling commands, you'll see that there's a submenu here called Survey Input, and there is an item here called 2D polys to 3D contours, and you can use that to convert 2D polygons to 3D polygons or 3D contours. There's also one to convert 3D polygons to 3D loci. There's a grid method entry which essentially will divide up an image that you might have of a large site model that has contour lines drawn on it that you can't actually select. So it's like an aerial photograph, but that it might have contour lines superimposed on it, and you can divide that up into a grid and then map the spot levels at the various points on the grid. I guess the simplest way to get information is if your surveyor has gone out on site and taken spot levels and can provide those spot levels to you in a text file. And if that happens, then you can use this import survey file command to import those points into Vectorworks, and when you import them they will be created as stake objects, this object here. Now one of what those files look like, and I'll go to one of those now, it's just a text file, and on each line of the text file are 3 values. They'll generally be in meters. In this particular one they're in millimeters. This is the X, Y and Z, or eastings, northings and elevation of each 3D point that the surveyor has measured. So that's one point, that's another point, that's another point, and each of these values are separated by a tab. So this is called a tab delimited file, so because each value is separated with a tab from the keyboard, and each value is on a separate line. Occasionally the file will have a header at the top saying that this is XYZ or eastings, northings or whatever, but you can't have more than one line at the top here. So you can have one line at the top here, and the import dialog will allow you to strip out that line and ask Vectorworks to ignore it by saying it's just a header line, and start with line number 2. So when you get the text file, it must only have 3 number values on each line from start to finish. If it's got anything else in it, and it's worth looking at the text file, if you get one from a surveyor, just delete anything in there that doesn't look right. And the other point to note with information from surveyors is that often they will have measured ridge lines, the tops of trees, the tops of fences and things like that, and obviously if you are trying to map a terrain, then you need to just use the spot levels from the ground. No good putting in spot levels from trees or fences or ridge lines or whatever. So once you have your 3D information, then you can go ahead and use that to create the site model. Now what's important with the site model is that generally what you want to do is to create the existing conditions and then create or modify that terrain using the site modifiers. And you need those 2 terrain models together, and Vectorworks creates them together automatically, so you can then do cut and fill calculations. So here I've got a series of spot levels that have been taken from a site, and these are in millimeters, and you have to bear in mind that quite often surveys are done in meters, so you need to be aware of whether you're using millimeters or meters. This file is set to use millimeters. And these are all stake objects. You'll see if I select this, it says stake object. You can see its Z value in the object info palette, and the mode is set to include as site model data. So once I have that information, I can select all of that, and I can then go to the create site model command, and this is in the AEC menu in Vectorworks Architect. So we go to create site model, and then you'll get some options appearing here. You can name the site model, so you can have multiple site models in your file. We'll just keep that. You can choose to keep the original source data in the layer, so that's all of these stake objects. You can leave them there in the layer, but they are all stored within the site model anyway, so there's really no need to keep them on the layer. But if you do keep them on the layer, I then recommend you move the site model to a different layer, because it just gets too confusing to have them both on the same layer. So we won't check that. We've got the maximum and minimum elevations here, so this is the highest contour and this is the lowest contour. And if you want to change these, it could be that you don't want to display contours below a certain level or above a certain level. That's why you have these options in here. You've got the contour interval, so this is the spacing of the contours that are going to appear in Vectorworks. So if you said you want them at 1 meter intervals, and you put 1 meter in there, and if you want a thick line every 4th contour, then you would put 4 in there. And then here we get to choose the display settings. You can choose existing, proposed, or existing and proposed. We'll just leave this on existing for the moment. And the style of the contours can be 2D contour. Generally it's one of these two. I'll choose smooth because that just gives a slightly better look, even though it doesn't increase the or affect the accuracy. draw a site border, so that it's going to find the edges of your site model and draw that border in there, and show labels. It's going to put the text labels on there. For 3D, let's put this onto proposed, and the style that I like to use is the mesh solid, which kind of looks like a piece of cake that's cut out. You get sides on the model. So here you get to choose which site modifiers to use. So we only want to use the site modifiers on this layer, the same layer as the site model, but you can use it from other layers. And then you've got all sorts of controls over the colors of the lines and the fills and so on. We won't go into those. So let's go ahead and click OK, and Vectorworks is going to go ahead and create this site model. So we're getting the contour lines every meter, and we're getting the heavier line every fourth contour line, with the number showing us what the level is there. So essentially this is the existing terrain, and you'll see that if we switch to, say, a right ISO view, and I'll render this in OpenGL, you can see that we've got a terrain model here, and each one of these triangles or vertices here is represented by a spot level that was taken on the site. So essentially what we've got here now is the existing terrain, and the next step will be how you can modify that existing terrain. It's not uncommon when you get site model information from a surveyor or from some other source that it's old information, and that there are actually some modifications that have happened since that survey drawing was done. Consequently, Vectorworks has a way of actually allowing you to modify what it's going to use as the existing information before you then begin to modify it with what you're proposing. So let's have a look at how you might do this. And if we go to the site modeling toolset, and we take the site modifying tool, and let's say for argument's sake that there was an area here that was flattened out after this was done, and that's basically the existing terrain. So what I could do is to use the site modifier, and I'll just put in a fairly simple shape here, and as a site modifier we want to put in a pad, and we want to apply it to the existing terrain, and we need to choose an elevation, and it's going to be somewhere 12, 11, 10, probably about 9 meters, so we'll put in 9 meters here. So what we're saying essentially is that, and you'll see that the site model has now become out of date. So what we're essentially saying here is, look, after this survey was done, this area here was flattened out, and that's how it is today, and that's what I need to be my starting point, or my existing terrain. Now when you put in a modifier like this, you have to tell Vectorworks how far beyond the site model, or how far beyond this area, and remember we've set the elevation of this to 9 meters. How far beyond does that am I allowed to modify the terrain? And generally you'll want to define an area around here which limits the extent of this object. Well, let's just zoom in a little bit. So we have to put another object around here, and we'll take the same tool again, and we'll say don't go beyond this line that I'm drawing now. And instead of this being a pad, it's called a boundary. So this is the boundary, and it applies to the existing terrain. So we've got this area is going to be flat, and then we've got this boundary object, which is the limit of how much away from the pad we're modifying the site model. So once we have those two elements in there, we can select the site model and we could ask it to update. And you can see now that the site model has updated in terms of the little bit of extra information we put in here. Now, you can actually use a site modifier object like we just used to modify the terrain. You can also use a stake object, and you can even use 3D loci, but I think using a stake object, if you're wanting to just put a point or a couple of points on a terrain to modify it, is the best thing. You can also use a 3D polygon to modify a terrain, provided the polygon is all at the same level. So to just show you what I mean with that, if I was to delete this object, this pad, and instead take a stake object and put that in here, and I'll just put one stake object in here, and we'll put it in here and choose site modifier object. So we're saying, okay, this object is going to modify the site, and we want it to modify the existing terrain. It's within the boundary, and let's set this to, say, 12 meters. So what this should do if we update the terrain is to give us a high point here that then goes out to this boundary limiting object here. So again, we're still just modifying the existing terrain. So we'll select the site model and click update, and that's what happened. What's happened, we've got this higher point up here, and it's modified the terrain back out to there. If we were to take a look at this in 3D, you'll see essentially what we've got there. So there's the high point that I put in there being modified out to roughly where that boundary object was. So I think you can get the gist now. So you start off with some existing information. You can modify that existing information if you want to, and then now you can add the new modifications that are going to be the difference between your existing terrain and the proposed terrain. Just to simplify things, I'll get rid of those, and we'll now modify the proposed terrain. So the first thing we'll do is switch to our model and just adjust a couple of things in the object info palette. If you recall, when we set this up, we had the 2D display set to existing, and that's why we're getting the dashed lines here. You do actually have the option of showing existing, proposed, or proposed and existing, and if you put it onto proposed, you'll see all of these lines will become solid. Once we have put some modifications in there for the proposed terrain, if we show them both, then you'll see the existing contours dashed and the proposed contours solid. A couple of other things is that we'll just check that the area display type is on square meters. The default is probably use document units, which in this case is millimeters. And volume display, we also want to set that to cubic meters. So as with creating the terrain, there are essentially three ways that you can, or three types of object you can use to modify the terrain. You can use the site modifier tool, this one here. You can use the stake object, and you can also use 3D polygons that may be in the shape of contours. And we'll look at those three systems. Let's begin with using the site modifier, and let's assume that we want some kind of flat area up here to put some kind of building on. So we'll go ahead and draw this, and it doesn't have to be rectangular or anything of a particular shape. So you can see that the site model has immediately become out of date because it needs to be updated. Now what we've got here is a pad, and the elevation of the pad needs to be specified here, and it's going to be roughly 19 or 20 meters. Looking at the contours here, we could place a stake object and get a better idea, but we can always come back and adjust this Let's start it at 19 meters. So we'll select the elevation here and put in 19m, which will give us 19 meters. Now we then have to define a boundary object around this to limit the extent of the terrain modification. So again, we use the site modifier tool, and we'll go in here and just put this boundary object around here. And this one we're going to set to a boundary, and we need to set it to the proposed terrain. So this is now going to be modifying the proposed terrain, not the existing terrain, and I think I'll need to do that for this pad as well. Let's set that back to proposed. So both these are then going to be modifying the proposed terrain. So right now we could go back and select the site model and click update, and you'll see that these contours here are now changing to reflect those two site modifiers we put in there, and you can see that the terrain is not modified beyond our boundary object here. Now let's take a look at a quick look at the cut and fill calculations to see whether we're having to import or take away fill from the site. So we'll click the update cut and fill calculations, and you'll see that we're pretty close here, 1402 and 1482 cut and fill. So there's only a net of 79 difference between those. So we'll need a little bit more fill. So I could lower this down. Raise this up a little bit to just balance that out. So you can play around with the level of this so that you can get your cut and fill calculations exactly right. Now we also have the option of putting a slope on this object, and we can do that by adding an angle in here. And when we put an angle, you'll see, let's say we want this slope to just 3 degrees, so the water's going to run off it. We get a new little widget that appears, and this is indicating the direction of the rise. So we could say put that from the top point being there and the bottom point being there, so there's going to be a 3-degree rise across the slope here, and I can turn that slope arrow on and off if I want to. So now when I again update the terrain, it's going to change slightly because the slope of this is slightly going with the slope on the natural slope of the land. Okay, so a moment ago I said we could also use stake objects as site modifiers, which we can do. So if we take a stake object and we place one on the drawing here, then we need to set its mode to site modifier object. And once we do that, we can then choose whether it's affecting the existing or proposed. In this case we want it to affect the proposed, and we need to set a level for this. Now we've got 12, 11, 10 meters, so this is about 10.5 meters at this point here. So what I might do is just put this at say 12 meters, 12m, and you can see that the level is now reading out there. And I'm just going to duplicate this a few times to create a kind of raised area here. Now again, I'm going to have to put a modifier object around this, which is a boundary object. So we'll go to site modifiers and let's surround this with the boundary object. Remember, with the boundary object we need to set it to proposed, and we need to set it to boundary, so we're getting the dashed line. So now if I update the site model, we're going to get a kind of weird modification here of the contours here. This is a fairly unnatural thing to be doing here, but you get the gist of what we're doing. Let's remove those objects and let's update the site model, and this time we'll use the 3D polygon tool from, actually what we'll do is use the 2D polygon tool and convert these to 3D polygons. or perhaps the polygon tool. So what I'm going to do is to zoom in here, and let's say that what we're wanting to create here is a kind of little hill. So what I'm going to do is to create a series of essentially contours that will represent a little mound here, or a big mound, because it's actually quite a big site model. Now these all have a fill, so I'm just going to set the fill to none so I can see the one underneath, set that fill to none, and we've got these three. So what I'll do now is select them. Remember, they have to be 3D polygons, not 2D polygons. And we can just go modify, convert to 3D polygons, and they'll convert to a group. I can ungroup that, modify, ungroup, and I'll get 3 3D polygons. Now I need to set the Z level of these polygons. So remember, this was 12, so if I set this to say 15 meters, so we've got a 3D polygon, so we'll set this to 15 we'll set this to 14 meters, and we'll set this one to 13 meters. So we've now got some polygons in place here. And we need to put a boundary around these. And there's one other thing we need to do. If you want to use 3D polygons as contours, we need to put them in a special class. So if we select the three of them, we choose class site DTM modifier. You can't see that, but that's the class site -DTM modifier. And once you put them in that class, then they will be used as site modifiers. So going back to our site planning toolset, grab this and let's put a boundary around here. Something like that. Set this to proposed, set this to boundary, and let's now update our site model, and you can see that the contours have quite closely matched the shapes that we've got here. And if we look at this in a right ISO view, you can see our 3D polygons there. And if we render this, you can see that we've got our little mound there, and up here we've got our flat pad that we put in, well, nearly flat, with the 3-degree slope on it. Now at this point we've got to update our cut and fill calculations, and obviously we're going to need a whole lot more fill now because we've added this this mound here. So essentially this is the way that you can create and modify terrains. There are a couple of other things I want to mention. Earlier on in this video I said that you could always access the terrain information, the source information, and you can do this by right-clicking on the terrain model, and you'll see here, if we choose edit, choosing edit is just the same as clicking the site model settings button. Edit source data, if we choose edit source data, then we're taken into the terrain model, and now we can see all of those original stake objects that were used to create the DTM. So I could actually come in here and modify these if I wanted to. We can click the exit source button there, and there are a couple of other options here. Edit site border. Now if you recall, in our site model settings we asked it to draw a site border, and it's actually, because this site is exactly rectangular, it's created a rectangular polygon, and you'll just see that now. If we go in here, right click and choose edit site border, you'll see that we have a rectangular polygon around this site. But let's say you only wanted to see a part of this site, not all of it. We could reshape this this polygon here, or we could draw a new polygon. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's say that we only want to show this portion of the site model. It doesn't have to be rectangular in shape, you can define any shape. So that will now become the border for the site model. We'll get rid of the original one, select it and delete it, exit site border, and you can see now that what we're seeing is a smaller portion of our site model. And if we render that, so that can be quite handy when you generate a large site model. You can even use it, you can see here, for cutting sections through a site model if you wanted to. So that's quite a useful feature as well. So this video isn't designed to be a completely extensive discussion about every aspect of site modeling. It's really just designed to get started with site modeling and understanding a few of the basic processes involved.